Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a legal paradox so fascinating and honestly, almost unbelievable, that it had to go all the way up to the Supreme Court of the Philippines to get sorted out. We're looking at a scenario that is going to challenge your most basic assumptions about crime, punishment, and the actual mechanics of our justice system. Honestly, it's the kind of case that really makes you rethink what it means to be proven guilty under the law.
So let's just dive right into this massive contradiction. How does a man who explicitly pleads guilty to murder legally walk free? It creates this instant cognitive dissonance, doesn't it? I mean, common sense tells us that if someone stands up in a court of law and literally says, "Yeah, I did it," well, the gavel should drop and the prison door should close, right? But the law, especially as we're going to see in the Supreme Court decision for GR No. 241257, operates on a much deeper level of constitutional safeguards.
To really ground our understanding of the philosophical weight we're dealing with here, the ruling itself actually kicks off with this heavy quote from the ancient Roman philosopher Marcus Tullius Cicero. He wrote, "For there is but one essential justice which cements society. Whoever neglects this law, whether written or unwritten, is necessarily unjust and wicked." It sets the stage perfectly for our explainer today because we aren't just talking about some random technical loophole here. We're talking about the essential justice that binds society together and what happens when the state itself completely neglects the rules.
Okay, let's get into Section 1, the guilty plea paradox.
Let's go back to August 20th, 2009. A man named Brendo Pagal, who goes by Dindo, is being arraigned for the stabbing death of Selma Pagal. The charge is murder, which is a capital offense in the Philippines, punishable by reclusion perpetua or life imprisonment. And during this arraignment, Brendo Pagal explicitly pleads guilty to the crime. He openly admits to the capital offense right there in front of the trial court. So, case closed, right? Actually, scratch that, it's not even close to being over.
Moving on to Section 2, the threefold duty.
Here's where things get super interesting. Rule 116, Section 3 of the 2000 Revised Rules of Criminal Procedure totally changed the game. Decades ago, a guilty plea might have been enough for a judge to just hand down a sentence and call it a day. But not anymore. Because the penalty for a capital offense is so severe, the rules now mandate a strict threefold duty for the trial court. First, the judge absolutely must conduct a searching inquiry to ensure the plea is 100% voluntary. Second, the court has to require the prosecution to actually prove the accused's guilt and exact degree of culpability. And third, the accused must be allowed to present evidence on their own behalf. Basically, a guilty plea is no longer a free pass for the prosecution to just skip doing their homework.
Which brings us to a really crucial piece of legal jargon you need to know, the improvident plea. This happens when a guilty plea is entered, but the trial court completely fails to conduct that mandatory searching inquiry. They don't ask about the accused's educational background, they don't check if they were coerced, they don't thoroughly explain the terrifying consequences of saying, "I'm guilty." And in Brendo Pagal's case, the Supreme Court found the trial court entirely failed to conduct this inquiry. So legally speaking, his plea was improvident.
All right, Section 3, 4 missed chances.
So remember that second duty we just talked about? The prosecution still has to prove the guilt of the accused regardless of the plea. Well, the trial court gave the prosecution 4 separate hearing dates between November 2010 and July 2011 just to present their witnesses. They issued repeat subpoenas to people, including a doctor. And what did the prosecution do? Absolutely nothing. Across 4 separate dates, despite having the awesome, massive power of the state at their disposal, the prosecution completely failed to present a single witness or a single shred of evidence against Brendo Pagal. After that 4th strike, they literally just submitted the case for decision.
And here is the absolute kicker. Despite the prosecution presenting zero evidence, I mean literally nothing besides that improvident plea from the arraignment, the regional trial court went ahead and convicted him anyway. They convicted Brendo Pagal of murder and sentenced him to reclusion perpetua, effectively locking him away for the rest of his life, based entirely on a flawed plea and an entirely empty prosecution record. Crazy, right? Which leads us to Section 4, the legal dilemma.
As you can imagine, when this hit the Supreme Court, the justices were deeply divided. You had side A, which included Justices Zalamita and Javier, arguing that the case should be remanded, sent back to the trial court for a total redo. They wanted to seek closure for the victim's family, pointing out that because the trial court and the prosecutors were so negligent, a true verdict had never actually been reached. But then you have side B, the majority. They argued for an outright acquittal. Their stance was pretty clear. The state was given ample opportunity, they completely squandered their chance, and under the Constitution, the presumption of innocence absolutely must prevail.
Let's unpack the majority's reasoning here, because they had some very strong practical and legal reasons against simply hitting the redo button. First off, By the time the Supreme Court was making this decision, Brenda Pagal had already spent 11 years sitting in preventive detention. 11 years! Second, ordering a brand new trial after more than a decade blatantly violates his constitutional right to a speedy disposition of cases. Third, just from a purely practical standpoint, witnesses' memories fade over a dozen years. Holding a truly fair trial at that point becomes nearly impossible. And finally, the state, with all of its vast, limitless resources, must not be allowed to endlessly vex a citizen with multiple prosecutions just because they couldn't be bothered to do their job right the first time around.
And that brings us to Section 5, Justice in Human Rights.
The entire philosophy of this ruling really rests on understanding a profound power dynamic. The court actually quotes a previous case, Secretary of Justice versus Lantition, stating, "The individual citizen is but a speck of particle or molecule vis-a-vis the vast and overwhelming powers of government." They are reminding us of the massive, almost unbelievable power imbalance in a criminal trial. Think about it. The state has the police, the prosecutors, the infrastructure, the endless funds. The citizen is incredibly vulnerable. If the state, with all of that power, cannot prove its case, it simply cannot be allowed to keep trying over and over again until it gets it right, all at the expense of a citizen's liberty.
So, relying strictly on the rule of law, the Supreme Court did something legally necessary but practically shocking. They formally acquitted Brenda Pagal, and it's crucial to understand why. It's not because they magically determined he was innocent of the act, but because the prosecution completely and utterly failed its constitutional burden of proof. The trial court failed its duty to do the searching inquiry, and the prosecution failed its duty to present literally any evidence. Because of those monumental failures by the state, the constitutional presumption of innocence had to be the winner. The burden of proof has to be carried by the prosecution on the strength of its own evidence, never on the weakness of the defense.
Which leaves all of us with a pretty heavy, provocative thought to ponder. In that delicate balance of power between one single citizen and the mighty machinery of the state, who should actually pay for the system's mistakes? If our highest courts bend the rules just to cover up for a lazy prosecution, do we lose the very essence of justice that Cicero warned us about at the start of this explainer? It is definitely a counterintuitive outcome, but as we've seen, these rigid, sometimes frustrating mechanics of justice are literally the only thing shielding that speck of a citizen from tyranny. Thank you so much for joining me today on The Explainer as we walk through the incredible legal paradox of People v. Pagal. Keep asking those tough questions and keep seeking to understand the systems that govern our lives.